Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my colleague, Craig Jordan Baker, who teaches creative writing at the University of Brighton. As well as that, Craig is a well-published author. His first novel, which you may be able to see behind us, The Nankulians, was published in 2020. And he's also published something he calls a hybrid text, which is an account of his walk along the length of Northern Ireland's River Bann. This year, Craig is busy, as well as Brick Dust, which he'll be reading from today. He is currently editing a collection of essays on writing landscape and setting in the Anthropocene, which may be something that we'll touch on in our discussion, and also a book for Transworld Penguin on knowing the nature near you, which is about enriching nature access, which I think is the key term there, through species education. If we can start, Craig, with you telling those of us who haven't read your book.
Nearly everyone, apart from you.
Well, I've been very lucky to have had advance copy. Yeah, so maybe just help us by telling us a little bit about what is the novel, what's it about, what's the basic story that you're telling.
So in its most basic sense, Brick Dust is an intergenerational family drama, I suppose. It focuses on a working class Anglo-Irish family called the Nankulians. So there's definitely a link there with my first novel, but it's a standalone piece of work. And it focuses, starts in 1950s and finishes in the present day. And it takes up, in each chapter, takes up a different character from family, or someone related tangentially to the family. I call it a kind of distributed narrative in the sense that it's got no main character, though some characters are more prominent than others. And it really is sort of telling a story through the lens of genealogy and family and connection, rather than following any kind of arc of an individual. So that's the kind of family aspect, I think, to it. And the other thing to say is that Brick Dust is what I call, I guess, an archive. And as well as the prose chapters, every single prose chapter is followed by a document, and that document could be the AGM minutes for a Morris dancing side. It could be a letter to someone about their library finds for all the Sylvia Plath novels they've destroyed, and it's an archive in this sense because it's narrated by an archivist, and this is a chap who's, I guess, purposefully enigmatic, but he lives in a council flat and has accrued over years many documents that including like cigarette cards from the Titanic, a kind of deed polls, back copies of the Daily Echo, which, as I'm sure you know, is the local rag in the Southampton area, the local paper. And he's about to be chucked out of his council flat because he's built up too many documents. So this is his chance to tell the story of the family through those documents. So it's a work of kind of archival storytelling as much as it is, that's the frame narrative, as much as it is about the kind of family themselves.
Okay, that's a very thought-provoking answer for me. I think the question we plan to go on to is, what's political about the novel? What is a political novel? But just when you talk about documents and the importance of documents in the book, that feels a very urgently political concept in the light of something like the Windrush scandal in the UK, that the necessity to find documents and to prove your existence, to prove your presence through documents has become politicized. So was that something that was in your head when you were thinking about the form?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's partly through my teaching on at the University of Brighton. Also, I teach about archival theory, about the idea of the archives as partial, archives as endlessly retellable resources, and also the idea that that through the auspices of the state, things gain reality through the auspices of officialdom, through let's just think about marriage rights. Okay, that's been something that's been fought over. What people are essentially, what maybe kind of like many queer couples are looking for is being recognised through a document, even though other people might call it just a piece of paper, which is the kind of cliche about marriages, that we might say, oh, it's just a piece of paper. That piece of paper can make a massive material difference to one's existence and how you interact, and the rights that you'll have in any context. So there's a constant, I think, emphasis in the novel about not just the act of archiving and telling stories through documents, but also the reality and the fiction that they can afford characters, people, places.
Okay, great, thanks. So shall we sort of sidestep into the question that we talked about, which is, because obviously one of the contexts for you writing this novel has been the project that we're doing, the cartographies of the political novel in Europe. So do you have a kind of working definition of what you think a political novel is, and is that something you can maybe relate to the novel that you've ended up writing?
To quote Skunk Anansi, yes, it's fucking political. Everything is political, which I think is a useful adage. But of course, I think that can lead to then no one trying to engage with politics. If everything's political automatically, it can sort of actually act as a kind of philistinism where we don't engage and we don't talk about. So there are political questions, but I think everything can be political if given a certain kind of frame. And I think that frame is around the structures that inform people's sense of action, identity, and selfhood, and the lives that they lead, and also, I think, really crucially, the lives they can lead. And I think for myself as a writer from a working class background, I kind of exist being aware that the life I lead now, and maybe this might sound silly to others, but life I lead now is a life I shouldn't have led. And there are characters in my novels, Greg Niculian, who is sort of a third generation of the Niculian family, who is a version of me that's a slightly duller kind of person that works in a shop and kind of is never really going to find his way particularly. And then there's another character called Betty Niculian, who is very intelligent and literarily accomplished, but she ends up killing herself, partly due to certain kinds of pressures that are related to her upbringing, and so I'm also concerned about those structures that not only allow us to act, but those structures that set the limit on our actions as well.
Okay.
I think those are the things, when I think about politics, those are the kind of questions I think about.
Okay. Thanks. I will say I found Greg less dull here than in Manculian, so I feel you've redeemed him a little bit this time around. But so I think this is where we planned for you to read the first extract from the novel, and this is Greg's great aunt.
Yes, that would be, yeah.
Who has two names.
Yeah. Yes, well, as I'll explain in the chapter, this is chapter 3, and it's called Gross Domestic Product, GDP in brackets, and there are lots of acronyms in this chapter, and there's also a lot of acronyms which flow through the novel, and I guess I'm interested in what acronyms do and also what acronyms shut out as well. And it's set in 1980, and it focuses on a character who was called Shannon Niculian, and then she changed her name and she identified as English when she came to England. And there's a letter in the first or the second chapter where she sends a letter to her family and says, "I'm no longer Irish. I've married an English guy. See you later, folks. That's me done." And this is about her some decades later in 1980. It was a Monday, and they had Nordic crispy pancakes for dinner. You know, the ones with cheese and bacon in them. They had mashed potato too, and peas and salt and pepper to taste. He had coffee and she had tea. He mentioned the possibility of having pudding, but she refused due to the worry of expanding waistlines. He mentioned the possibility of a different flavour of Nordic crispy pancakes for Monday dinner, to which she replied that if he wanted to do the shopping, he could go right ahead. After dinner, he retired into the florally wallpapered living room and she did the dishes. She could smell his pipe smoke drifting through to the kitchen, and it reminded her of nothing, because this is what she would always smell. After the dishes were done, she came into the living room and they exchanged a brief but friendly smile. She sat down and together they watched a game show where the men were old and the women were young. During that evening, he laughed twice and she laughed once. At him when he overturned his ashtray while shouting out at the TV that the capital of Australia was Sydney, when the contestant thought it was Canberra. Now, Shauna Jones was a kind of fiction. Naturally, she had got her deed polls and her certificates to prove Shauna Jones did exist, but that's not what I mean. Because once upon a time, Shauna Jones had been Shannon Nakulian. While that too might have been a kind of fiction, it all goes to show that the getting of documents and the telling of stories about ourselves is often what we mean when we say we're getting on with our lives. Like many people getting on with their lives, Shauna lived in a terraced brick house, had 2 children and a husband who sometimes seemed less real to her than the people she watched on television. And because getting on with your life meant being a good citizen, Shauna often volunteered at local fetes, galas and fairs, where she ran tombolas, raffles and sweepstakes for the likes of the WI, the YMCA, the RNLI, and once, due to a misprint, the INLA. The other thing to note about Shauna was that she loved Margaret Thatcher and saw her as utterly and searingly real. She loved Margaret Thatcher's angled clothes, her deep voice, her military deportment. She also loved the fact that Maggie, who was now Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, had invented Mr. Whippy ice cream. She loved that the PM wore outsized jewellery and denounced people with matronly contempt. She loved the Iron Lady for her Englishness, her coolness, and above all, her busyness. On her colour television, equipped with a signal booster Frank had installed last weekend, she was watching the Iron Lady coming through crystal clear on the 9 o'clock news. In his lounger, Frank was consumed with his paper and chewed at the end of his pencil as he made his daily attempt at the Daily Mail crossword. On the BBC, Thatcher was nodding and pointing from a podium, from upon which she gazed down at a sea of mustachioed journos and hacks. Shauna was not paying much attention to Thatcher's words because she felt confident that whatever Thatcher said would be sensible. There was something in there about the nation's problems, about ASLEF and the IRA, about the USSR and the GDR. Shauna sipped at her tea and then leant back a little further into her settee. Yes, Thatcher meant something to Shauna. Thatcher meant that you could make yourself the self you wanted to be and that your positivity and your sense of purpose would be rewarded. And look at her. Thatcher was a woman, and soon, Shauna thought, there would be women everywhere. There would be women engineers and bus drivers, women bricklayers and women milkmen. There would be more women artists and architects and writers too. And she recalled that a niece, one of wee Sean's girls, called Betty, wanted to be a writer. And even though Shauna had never met her niece, she sometimes daydreamed of Betty in her room with her posters of pop stars and 19th century novelists. Shauna was convinced that women were soon going to be everywhere and everything was going to improve if women were only willing to work for it. Ah, it must be counterfeit, said Frank to his Daily Mail crossword. Shauna dunked a malted milk into her cup of tea and put the wet part of it into her mouth. Yes, she thought, as Thatcher strode off the stage and the news cut back to the studio. Yes, Thatcher meant you could be a woman and be yourself. And even if that self was the same self as somebody else, someone who had the same Leyland hedge, someone who had the same blender, the same microwave, the same telephone, the same husband, the same television with signal booster, well then, so much the better. For whose job is it to tell you that you shouldn't be like somebody else? Tuesday night quiz. Shauna had caught Frank speaking to her and glanced up. Sorry, what was that, love? Frank sighed and spoke a little slower. I said, dear, that I won't be back for dinner tomorrow. I'm out with the boys for the Tuesday night quiz. Shauna looked at him a little blankly. Yes, love. That's what you do every Tuesday.
Thank you.
And I got a bark for that as well.
Yeah. So I've heard you read that section of the novel before, and on that occasion you read another section which didn't make it into the final novel, and which was more abstract and less rooted in character, and could potentially be identified as more sort of capital P political. I mean, it gave a class analysis, albeit through a particular narrative voice, which was perhaps a bit more demotic. So I wonder if it's useful to kind of track back to your response to what is a political novel, and to maybe talk about what the value of rooting it in a group of characters in the way that you have, how that's allowed you to kind of access some of the politics of the novel.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I've got to say that it's a funny thing for a novelist to be kind of generously given hours and given sort of funding to be able to write a novel, but then of course I think in the same way that I imagine, for various reasons, being the poet laureate must be a sickening and horrible experience. But one of the things is you've got to kind of write to a certain kind of brief, and I admit at a certain point in writing this novel, I felt like I needed to make sure that I was satisfying my funders, and this was a problem for me in writing the novel. And when it came to the first draft, my editor at Epoch Press is Sean Campbell. He rigorously and without any prompting picked out the pieces that were overtly political and said, these are the weakest pieces, get rid of them. And it was a real relief, actually, and for that to happen. And also for someone that was totally, he didn't have any skin in the game of, he was just looking at it from a publisher's perspective. And so that went, and I think that really freed me up to keep to the thematics and the character led drama of the novel as a whole, and also to be genuinely convinced that I am absolutely talking about politics, not in just a superficial way a la Skunk and Nancy, but as you mentioned, with, for example, the idea of documentation and the power of the state to make things real in a really, to change the world, to have causal effect on the world that we live in, or to refuse your citizenship, let's say, that makes a real difference to the life you will lead, or may lead. So yeah, that was a really interesting experience. But the piece you talk about was about poverty, and it initially came out of a concern to write. I was interested in, coming from a background where my family were very poor, and sometimes those kind of like things like you can always put food on the table poor. I wanted to write about that, but then I think I was just writing that for the wrong reasons, and I was really happy that I had enough support around me to say, don't do that, Craig. and so I think that's made the novel much more succinct and svelte as a result.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear, I think, from the extract that you just read, that that is a section, however brief, that is talking about kind of politics of gender, is talking about politics of class, is thinking about the way in which the national intrudes on the domestic. And I guess that using the television as a way of doing that is kind of quite a nice device. But the title of the chapter, Gross Domestic Product, it feels as though you're playing on a pun, or not pun, but a double meaning for domestic around both the home and the nation. And that it feels to me that that's something that is a really strong theme in the novel. So I wonder if you could, talk a little bit about that, kind of how important that idea of home is, and how you think that might be being kind of politicized through the text. I mean, I've mentioned to you, I think, that I was really struck by the different communities or the different origins of characters in the novel. People come to the city from various places, and that there are lots of characters who have to kind of demonstrate their belonging in particular locations. And you seemed a little bit surprised, I think, when I first said that that was prominent. So, but you clearly were trying to do something around that idea of belonging and home. And
that's a really, and it was a useful. I think you described it as the novel contains a lot of new Britons, and I think sort of first, second, third generation, or and you're absolutely right, it does. And I think I'm playing on immediately the domestic space as the sort of domos, the house, but then I think there's the sort of demos, as well, the broader, and there are characters there that are sometimes looking for, they might have a literal home, but they are certainly looking for a sense of belonging. So there's a character in the novel called Anne-Marie McGuinness, who is the illegitimate child of what you might call the paterfamilias of the Naculian family, called Nandad Naculian, and she was conceived by the banks of the Bann in Ireland, and then she's not recognised, but she spends some of the novel trying to be recognised by the Naculian family and resoundingly failing to be recognised, and she ends up, I guess, kind of like disjointed because she doesn't have a sense of home and herself, and her. She was adopted, and so there's lots of problems around where she feels at home. And then there's also there are characters, and I think we might see this in my next reading. There's lots of characters who simply assume home. So I think it's very easy, maybe particularly if you're from, I don't know, Southampton, to just assume that this is where I am, this is what it is. The phrase that I hate, the modern phrase I hate, it is what it is. But and because it reflects a sensibility where whatever I am is natural and obvious, and I don't even have to do any kind of work about definition or reflection. And I think for some people, their home is just that. It's that which is unreflected upon. And so I've got characters for whom home is an unreflected upon thing, in both a national and a literal house orientation. And then there are other characters, I think, for looking for home and often failing because of the structures we've talked about. They haven't got the paperwork. So I think that's that's an important way in which home plays out. And I would say with gross domestic product, domestic is, I think, a double entendre, or it's got many meanings, but also gross has also got many meanings as well in this context of it being just mass and also fairly disgusting as well. And it kind of, so yeah, there's a few ways which I'm tempting to be witty.
Okay. Well, I mean, and I should say it is a very funny book, and I read it over Easter and was constantly getting looks as I would laugh spontaneously. So, yeah, I mean, and people in the room watching won't necessarily know that I've spent my time in Southampton, and that you and I have talked a lot about it as a city.
Yeah.
And you, I think, talk very interestingly about the geography of the city as something that constructs or maintains certain kinds of exclusions. I mean, that's something that I think is in this book as well. It's interesting that Nandad Nankulian builds one of the major arterial bridges in the city.
Yeah.
Although he's not very good at building bridges in his family life.
Yeah, you picked up on that, yeah.
But and he makes the same joke. So I think the next section you're going to read actually is a little bit about how urban geography is sort of able to separate or build communities. In different kinds of ways.
Yeah. And maybe just before I read this, just to respond to some of your observations there, I would something I realised without I see like space very often as what I sometimes call like a silent inheritance, especially when we were in our hometowns. And I grew up on a council estate on the very east of Southampton, and it was a half-hour bus ride, and for me at times a very expensive bus ride into town. And I didn't realise until I left that space that I was actually on the absolute fringes. I was near very much some lovely countryside that was totally inaccessible because there wasn't any public transport, and I really didn't have my own for most of my life. And so my eye was turned into the centre of the city, but it was absolutely distant from me. And it was only when I left the city that I realised how profoundly that affected my. Yeah, I always felt literally on the fringes, and that in a spatial sense, but also, I mean, if you do talk to people from Southampton and you say, "Oh, you're from Thornhill," which is the state I was from, nearly every single time people will be like, "You're from Thornhill? You mean you're not mugging me right now and trying to, you know, suck my blood or something?" And people act quite. I've had many experiences where I've had people act really kind of viscerally to them, saying which part of the city I'm from, because there's such a bad reputation. But it's also on that absolute fringe there, and I think part of the story of why Thornhill has struggled in many ways is because it is just distant from everything that's going on, and if you live there you don't feel anything is going on. It's was all there was, and was all we were is from a recent sonnet by Diane Seuss, the American poet, and she reflects on poverty, and it's a lovely line of was all there was, and was all we were. And when I read that, I was just utterly struck by how that kind of really kind of summed up for me in some ways a kind of a certain sense of being in the past perfect. You know, and that being very much related to class.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it's a very interesting geography, I think, in terms of thinking about Britain's class politics. And you know, the Lancoulians is a really interesting. You've got a really interesting take on the minutiae of borders between Thornhill and Harefield, or Bitton Park. So that sort of Bitton Manor. So you know, those kind of gradations are really, I think, interesting, and very much a kind of annex to Southampton as in many of the ways in which it imagines a civic, and so that's something I think you do touch on. So maybe you can tell us about the pit.
So this is in 2005, and it's called The Pit, and this is one of the chapters that doesn't focus directly on a member of the Naculian family, but rather on someone in the generation of Greg Naculian, and it focuses on two characters, one called Gordon Kostek and one called Manu Alsaid. And Manu Alsaid briefly went out with Greg Naculian but found him too boring, and so dumped him, and then decided that she didn't like men at all, and so went so found her kind of true calling of who she wanted to hang around with. But this is more about the sort of, I think, the civic spaces, but also the kind of cultures and the subcultures that exist in cities. It's called The Pit, 2005. It took some time for Gordon Kostek to remember he was normal. When he did remember he was normal, it was no shock, but there was a sliding sense of guilt that the people he'd been hanging around with for the past year now were not in fact his people at all. The realization also came with a sliding suspicion of himself, as he wondered how he ever might have thought that these people were his people. But realizations happen slowly, and even more slowly in The Pit. The Pit was a small grey bricked area in the middle of the city's high street, and an oddity of town planning. Two short flights of steps either side led into a little box lined with black metal benches and bins emblazoned with the city's logo of a large ship hitting an even larger iceberg. The Pit was sunk in the high street like an innie belly button on a quavering stomach, or an island below sea level. Indeed, it had something of the atmosphere of the latter and something of the smell of the former. It was here that the city's freaks, faggots, weirdos, goths, grebos, queers, puffs, and headbangers hung out. The other people, the city's Garys, Townies, Mushdies, Mandies, and Norms, would never set foot in the Pit unless they came in sufficient numbers to guarantee dominance. On the occasions when this happened, they would berate the pit's ripped jean denizens for being freaks, faggots, weirdos, goths, grebos, queers, puffs, and headbangers. And if the townies were feeling particularly confident, a Barney might break out, sending roll-up filters and copies of Metal Hammer and 1984 flying into the narrow strip of sky above the high street. Gordon was one of their number, their sect, their clan. Or at least he was before he realised he was normal. How Gordon became associated with the pit's citizens was not complicated and could be summed up by the words love and Manu Al-Said. Now, I said it wasn't complicated, but bear with me while I try to make it so. Here's one way of putting it. Gordon grew up on mashed potato, fish fingers, and baked beans. If he was on death row and was asked what his last meal was to be, he would have asked for mashed potato, fish fingers, and baked beans. And if he was asked what drink he wanted, then he would ask for a glass of strong blackberry and apple squash. And this was, of course, because Gordon always had blackberry and apple squash, because Gordon self-identified as a normal person. His Babka had been liberated from Belsen as a girl and had come to England to marry a plumber from Basingstoke. His mother had been liberated from Basingstoke and had come to the city to marry a plasterer from nowhere, which meant he was just from the city. And Gordon and his sisters were all city-born and would never have thought about liberation, because sometimes people see the universe and their city as the same thing. Gordon knew his family were kind of Jewish and kind of Polish, but he didn't feel Jewish or Polish or anything special like that. He just felt normal, just as the city was normal, just as mashed spuds, fish fingers and baked beans were normal. He liked sportswear, he liked cars and football and girls who wore just enough makeup to be beautiful without being panto. He liked money too, and he didn't see any difference between selling and selling out, between greed and need, celebrity and authenticity. And like every normal person, he liked to have a big house somewhere in suburbia, within easy driving distance of major retail and commercial outlets. But what complicated all this normality was the fact that Manu Al-Said was not normal. Manu Al-Said had the strikingly smart and sexy and strange ways that were not the ways of normal people, or at least that was how Gordon saw it. He had first noticed her at the gates of City College, or if he hadn't, then that's what he pictured, because he had a normal imagination. He had noted a copy of a rock magazine flapping in her hand as she talked, and noted the black and red band t-shirt flapping from her frame. He noted that her makeup was more panto than beautiful, but somehow it made her look even more smart and sexy. He sighed then and looked dreamily outward, and the first lumbering power chords of a heavy rock ballad were strummed in his heart. It did not take long for Gordon, in an act of stone-cold mimesis, to buy a copy of that rock mag and get the same t-shirt he had seen on Manu's blessed frame. This initial attempt to move into the innie belly button of her acquaintance was far easier than he had expected. Quickly, she began to nod at him, then use his name, and before long, they were sat at the same table at lunch. He found out that she was English and Indian and Arabian, and was angry that anyone thought being Indian and Arabian were the same thing. Gordon, of course, thought that being Indian and Arabian were kind of the same thing, but he kept this belief tightly controlled. And it was not only recognition from Manu, but he also seemed to be accepted by the freak and weirdo group in general, who nodded at him, used his name, and let him sit at their table at lunch. Gordon wondered if this might be because the freaks were flattered to be joined by a normal person, and that this made them feel less lonely in their freaky weirdness. The fact of the matter is, though, that weirdos are just far more welcoming than normal people. The normal people, being normal, think it's the other way around. The weirdos of City College all knew Gordon had just picked up a magazine he'd never read and threw on the t-shirt of a band he hardly knew, but they also knew they'd all done that at some point too. But in being new to the freak and weirdo world, Gordon thought that Manu must have really liked him, and that the rest of the freaks and weirdos must have found him cool and interesting because they normally didn't have the privilege of contact with normal people. And he noticed too that his weirdo friends were good people, and weirdly, they talked about goodness. They ate vegetarian food, discussed their emotions, and were concerned about what happened in the world beyond the city. A world which, as far as Gordon could tell, they had no control over whatsoever. And they also had accepted him. This was what led to Gordon forgetting he was normal. This was what led to him being swallowed by the pit.
I really love hearing you write about Southampton. It's like I've never left. Yeah. I want to maybe reflect on your writing of place, because I think, you know, that's something, if we think about the other writing that you do, that's something that is quite important to you, and you're quite interested in what that does for writing. And I think one of the things that one of the claims you would make is that setting is never just setting. It's always doing some kind of other work. You've written about your experience of walking along the Ban, and the river Ban is one of the characters, maybe, or certainly one of the features of this book. And we begin and end in its proximity.
Yeah.
You know, that's a river that has some significance to the religious politics of Northern Ireland.
Absolutely.
So I wonder whether that's a type of geographical effect or power that you see being played out in the other sections or the other locations of the book. I don't know whether the Itchen quite has the Ban status, but
well, yeah, I mean, there are lots of rivers in the book, and one of them is the Itchen, and Nandad in the book has helped to build Northern Bridge, which goes across the Itchen. So there's lots of there are lots of bridges and lots of rivers, and the Ban forms a kind of bookend because it starts in Ireland in the 1950s and then finishes in Ireland in 2025. Around the kind of homestead and around the kind of within the proximity of the Ban River. And there's also another chapter where Anne-Marie, who I mentioned, she is an older woman, and she's kind of lost all hope of finding what she sees as her true family, her genetic family. And she looks to the river and lives within proximity of it and sees it as a kind of reflection of her desire for family, in the sense that the rivers in the pastoral tradition, they're so freighted with being the cradle of civilizations. We think of the Nile, and they've also, if you think about kind of pastoral settings, so someone is sitting by a river drinking some wine, etc. So rivers are hugely freighted with poetic and sentimental significance, I touch on that and I play on that, especially in the chapter very early on, where Nandad is who is a Northern Catholic is having sex with a Northern Protestant, and in the 1950s that is something that leads to that character being mutilated in a part of his body, which I will leave to the reader's imagination. But we have this pastoral setting on the Ban that then is kind of cut across with a sort of brutal sectarian violence. So rivers are important, and in my second book, as I think you mentioned, I walked the length of the River Ban with a friend of mine, the poet Cherry Smith, and that got me thinking about rivers as what are sometimes called in geography and in psychogeography as natural borders, rather than maybe, if you look at North Africa, you'll see lots of kind of straight lines because they've been literally carved up by people with a map, and rivers, and then you look at other borders and they'll be kind of defined by a river. And so rivers can act as kind of natural kind of barriers and ways of thinking about space, and especially in Northern Ireland, before it was created as a state, or you might say gerrymandered as a state, the first proposal was that Northern Ireland would be all the counties east of the ban, and all the counties west of the ban would just become part of the republic, and so you would have like a very much a supermajority. And for those that are maybe aware of Northern Ireland's politics, there is a general sense that if you go west of the ban, you've got more kind of Catholic and nationalist communities. If you're east of the ban, you've got more Protestant and Unionist communities, known as the ban divide. And so literally kind of it sort of to some extent divides that that statelet, but also works psychologically for people there as well. So yeah, that's definitely a really powerful or really important part for me in the novel to reflect that kind of reality in the way that natural borders can also impose psychological borders.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, well, on my first reading, I mistook the Northern Bridge for the toll bridge.
Oh, right.
So I think there's something kind of interesting about the fact that it's not, I mean, and local knowledge here, if you're not an attentive driver, you can find yourself having to pay to cross the river, and if because you need the other routes. So
still goes over the Itchen.
Yeah. But that sense in which even just crossing rivers is policed and taxed, and that these are not they're not innocent points in the landscape, I think is kind of interesting.
Well, going back to my previous comment about in my childhood feeling on the edge of the city, I remember just feeling, without even acknowledging it properly, whenever the 18 bus crossed the Northern Bridge, I would say I'm in Southampton now, like I'm in the city now, and everything before that was a kind of non-space. And so that was kind of the river was powerfully marking that kind of border. I remember going over, and there were these hulks, these very old kind of ships that were just been left for, I don't know. To me as a child, it might have been 300 years, it might have been 15 years, but nevertheless there were kind of these sort of spinal columns and rib cages of kind of like sort of derelict ships, and then the old scrapyard, and it felt like I really was kind of crossing a border between kind of like sort of a graveyard, which I kind of into something where there was some degree of life.
Yeah. I mean, and Anne-Marie McGuinness the second is the product of this sectarian union, and is adopted and brought up by quite a visibly Protestant family, who are quite proselytizing, it seems, and campaign. So I mean, was that something that had been was that an attempt at kind of reflecting on the Northern Irish politics and linking that to the family of the Nankulians, and was it?
That's a really useful question. Yes, absolutely. It's partly to do with the question of what family is, and this, obviously, but one should like the book, unlike before you like the kind of author, because the author's just neither here nor there in some ways. But my background is I grew up caring for young children. My family were a foster family, and I have two younger sisters that were adopted, and so I've been very conscious of the politics of family and what constitutes family, and how one feels part of or not part of a family. And that can happen in many ways. And I think, and for Anne-Marie McGuinness, she is adopted and into a very they're kind of they're free Presbyterians. They go around and they paint little signs with biblical passages, and they put them up around kind of County Down. And thinking they're doing the good work of the Lord, but also in the book it states that the man she called her father and the woman she called her mother, and it's always called, are people that even said to her, we're doing this out of our godly duty. We're not doing it because we love you. You are a daughter, and it's a very Kantian relationship. And so I think that there's a suggestion there in the novel that I was trying to get at, that whoever your caregivers are, if you have a strictly kind of Kantian, it's my duty to make you dinner. It's my, I always feel certainly like when parents describe it as their job to look after their child. I mean, yes, it is, but it sounds so much of duty rather than of kind of like freely given kind of affection or kind of service to another person, and I think that's what makes Anne Marie feel so disjointed in her world, because her parents, and I will call them her parents because they did most of the work, didn't saw her as an act of duty, and then her real family, her genetic family, are either dead or just aren't interested because they've got plenty of other problems. Yeah. And so I think the politics of the family there are really that's one of the she is included as a Nakulian because she's one of the main characters. But of course, in lots of ways, many of the Nakulians don't see her as a member of their family.
Yeah. And Shannon's kind of response to her when she knocks on the door is quite a sort of chilling one in some respects, but also is born of her, as you say, having plenty of other problems to deal with, and she doesn't need one more thing to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen this in my own experience and talking to people that have been adopted, etc. That it's very easy to fall into a romantic notion of family, of like the people I never met that I will have this brilliantly crystalline connection with, that will tell me all about myself in some kind of true and metaphysically satisfying way. And very often it doesn't happen, and if it does happen, it's probably by accident. And the story of Anne Marie is she tries and she sort of fails. She goes to Southampton in 1991 and tries to knock on the door of her. Knocks on the door of her family and is in her Sunday best and is very much kind of like Protestant Sunday best, trim, looking like a successful kind of like on it woman, and just gets utterly rejected. And the only recognition she gets is from the local chip shop owner, who recognises her accent and says, "Oh, you must be one of the Nakulians." And he says a lot of sexist nonsense to her, and she says, "Fuck off, will you?" and walks out. And then he calls after a typical Nakulian bitch, and that's the closest she gets to belonging to a family, which is the kind of recognition of a odious sexist kind of chip shop owner, that she is one of the family, but the family themselves don't recognise her.
Yeah, and it's, as a reader, I found that it was kind of pathetic in the sort of true sense of the word. I feel a great deal of pity for Anne Marie. But also I'm sort of always tempted, because of the type of critic I am, to see this as somehow, if not an allegory, but analogous to the bigger kind of issues about belonging and community that the novel touches on. And I guess one of the strengths of you as a writer is that you manage to allow me to do that while also engaging me with the characters and letting me enjoy reading about the sort of small lives as well as the big topics.
Maybe this goes back to this kind of rule of thumb, capital P, non-capital P politics. It's the kind of the idea that I guess I want to be resistant to propositionality. The idea I just say, this is the way things are. I don't think that's an engaging kind of way, but offering a suite of difficult situations that people can find themselves in. And I think when Mark was interviewing Eva Manessa a couple of weeks ago, I think she said something very similar, and I kind of heartily agreed with it. That you create the kind of grammar and the syntax, and you create the framework, but you allow other people to kind of like find the way through it, rather than having to tell them that X is bad and Y is good, etc. etc. I think that's also the blandest kind of we've got politicians for that. I don't think we need novelists to do that job, really.
Yeah. I mean, what would a category like the type, in the way that Lukács uses it, resonate with the way in which you see your characters? So he's very interested in the idea that characters are characters and they do something in the narrative, but they're also this kind of I suppose a key to understanding social relations and what he would call the totality through those.
Yeah, that's I haven't thought about Lukács in a long while. I would Actually, I don't know. I'm gonna say I don't know. There are certain kind of characters that I never try and create a caricature, but I'm also aware in a kind of like a sort of British Irish comedy kind of way that British Irish 90s comedy is very much a kind of force in me. That you create characters that are kind of like grotesque and but never quite reach the level of caricature because they've actually got some vulnerability or they've actually got some specificity about their lives, even if they're kind of out and out, I don't know, kind of like homophobes or kind of or just petty, unbelievably petty people. They never they hopefully can speak on their own terms, but also speak maybe like more anecdotally about a certain type. But I think types only ever work for me as a reader. They only ever really compel me and work when when a character has enough to them to say that they've got an individuality, as well as being bloke down the pub, or as well as being a kind of someone who fits into a certain social milieu. Everyone fits into a social milieu. I think that's a given, and you have to identify that. But I think there's something else which writers can do in terms of driving character, which is to recognise the social milieu which someone fits in, but in their particular style in which they fit into it. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think you've given an interesting answer.
That's a no, but
well, there are no answers.
Yes, okay.
No answers to real questions. I think there's only one thing left to do, which is to say actually there are two things left to do. One is to thank Craig for reading from his book and being so open to my questions, and the other one is to congratulate him on the publication of his novel, and to give him a small gift from the department.